next lecturer, Harry Quimby. It is Robert Myers from the Michigan Historical Society. We'll be giving that presentation. February 23rd will be the next one. Is going to be Detroit on VE Day. So in preparation for the 75th anniversary of VE Day, Professor Karen Miller will be coming to speak. She's been here a few times. She did the 43 Riots lecture a couple years ago, and she's usually pretty good. March 29th, Tom Dalton and Jim Edelman from Under the Radar, Michigan will be here. At this point in time, they will just be doing book signing. If we can raise a couple more dollars in sponsorships, we will probably have to try and book them for the full presentation. But their appearance fee is a little out of our reach at the moment. So, if anyone wants to kick into that, please let me know. And then April 29th, the last lecture we have scheduled at the moment, we're still working on a couple, will be Robert Crickney will be talking about Ford and the Arsenal of Democracy. He's out of the University Heritage area of the Speakers Bureau. So, mark your calendars. There's some flyers out there on the table for all of these. If you don't have one, there's also membership forms out there, donation forms, all that good stuff. So that's the end of my commercial. I would now going to turn this over to Elizabeth Kenward, who is our WOW Rosie president, yes, president. And she's going to introduce a couple of, we have a couple of original Rosies in the audience, and at least one that goes to the tank hunt. So she can introduce them and then we'll go with them.
But before you go, we need to thank you for your generous support to all of us. They allow us to meet here every month so that we can continue to preserve the legacy of our original Rosies, who you are going to find very, very exciting to talk to. They are full of life and energy, and that's why it's so important for us to continue to share their stories with all of you. But this is just a little token from all of the Rosies to all of you. You're welcome. My name is actually Betty Kenward. Elizabeth is when I get in trouble, which is often. I am the president of the Eastern Michigan WOW chapter of the American Rosie the Riveter Association. Does anybody here know what WOW stands for? That's why we're working so hard to continue this legacy. WOW stands for Women Ordnance Workers. And the women who work on the planes, as well as the tanks, as well as the munitions, worked with ordnances. And those beautiful ladies that are seated over there, ranging from ages 100 on down, are original Rosies. So girls, if you just wave your hands when I say who you are. Hold up your arms. There's Rosie Clara and Rosie Phyllis. Rosie Phyllis right in the back there, right over, you can see her, just turned 100 years young. I'm going to have Deborah, who is my vice president, read you a little bit about one of our Rosies. Rosie Angeline actually worked on the tanks, so it kind of ties in today's performance. So if Deb could just tell you a little bit about Angeline. There's Angeline right there.
Angeline, can you stand up, Angeline? Angeline actually worked in a tank plant, and I've got her bio that she's going to let me read. So she was actually born August 22nd, 1925 in Detroit. She was raised on a farm in Marine City, Michigan, and was one of 16 children. She graduated from Marine City High School in June of '43, and on July 7th of 1943, she was hired at Chris Craft Pleasure Boat Builders for the defense contract. She built personal and vehicle boats for the Navy. She built oak wood frames and started out working on the line to place, cut out boards on master frames. This involved nailing them down, gluing, sawing, hammering, nailing, and sawing in place. She can do it. She made 68 cents an hour. She left that company February 17th of 1945 to get a better paying job. She was hired into Dodge trucks in March of 45 and worked installing first aid boxes in Army trucks and worked there through August. In April of 1946, she was hired by LA Young Spring Factory. There she did coil tying while working on seats for the Army trucks and ambulances and worked there until May 7th of 46. Then she went to Dodge, Maine. And from June of 46 to October of 46, she worked in the wire room, inserting contact wires into connectors. She got married in June of 1948 to Edward Milkowski, who served in the Army during World War II. He served and fought in combat from 41 to 45. They had 2 children, born in 1950 and 51, and in March of 1953, she went to work for Briggs Manufacturing. There she had 1 week's training on riveting, 1 week. And then she did riveting and spot welding until April of 54. She had 2 more children, so she raised 4 children and was a welder. Putting out her frustrations, I'm sure. She worked at Burroughs from October of 58 until 65, and there she soldered circuit boards. During this time, she had 3 more children. She was not busy enough at work. One in 1961 and then twins in 65. In June 22nd, 66, she started at Rhett Electronics, where she did soldering on machine guns and worked there until July of 1966. She was then hired by LTV in July 1st of 66 and worked on Lance missiles there until September 27th. In May of 1982, she started at General Dynamics, and she did defense work. There she worked on the turret network box assembly for the Abrams AB-1 and AB-2 tanks. In between the defense jobs, she had other jobs, including working at a mattress factory, cigar factory. She took numerous classes, such as furniture upholstery, cake decorating, flower arranging, and sewing. You know, she had to get to reach out to her feminine side. At the age of 74, she got bored staying at home. So she applied and got another job working at Royal Radio. She did soldering on circuit boards and repaired radios. She worked there for 9 years until the business closed. When she was hired, she was told that because of her experience, she could name her pay and hours she wanted to work. So she worked full time, but started late on Tuesdays. Because on Tuesday mornings, you had what league? Because it says on Tuesdays you had a league.
Yeah.
What kind of league?
Bowling.
Oh, bowling league. Wow. We do prioritize.
Yeah.
But obviously, Rosie Angeline is very busy and very dedicated.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Other reasons why we call our chapter WOW is because after you hear their stories, the first thing you say is, wow. And they are wonderful, outstanding women. So thank you for letting us share their stories with you. And I hope you will help us to help continue their legacies. Thank you very much.
Honestly, it sounds like there's not a display case out in the museum that she did not have some sort of involvement in.
So maybe that's the model we need to have.
Yeah.
It's just going to be Annalee.
All right, so I guess I want to introduce Doug Harvey, our World War II vet, who's joined us today. He was in a 57 millimeter anti-tank.
What's that?
57 millimeter anti-tank.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, he was on an anti-tank gun.
Yeah.
So he had some first-hand experience about the tank destroying.
Wow.
You got one, right? Mark IV?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so without any further delay, I turn it over to Colonel Fred Schwarz, retired, and take it away.
All right, good afternoon, everybody can hear me? Because I won't use the mic if I don't have to.
Okay, today we're going to talk about US Army tank destroyers in World War II. This is a really interesting journey, as I called it. It's a journey of combat capability, and I'm going to take a look at it a little bit from a modern eye viewpoint, because my background was working in acquisition at the US Army Tank Command. I was the intelligence supervisor for all the intelligence. We supported all the acquisition programs, so I got to see how the sausage was made over 25 years. And so I took a little look at it from that viewpoint, and that's what we're going to do today. Why did I call it a journey? Well, the tank destroyer concept has been considered by many after the war to be a failure. I don't really think it was, and I'm not sure that's the right way to look at it, or that it was obsolete by the time the war was over. So I'm going to kind of take a look and see if is that the truth. We're also going to take a look, how did the tank destroyer concept come about? That's really important to consider whether it was a failure or not. And then what did the tank destroyer concept do for the Army during World War II and into its future? Today we call this combat capability development. What the Army does is it comes up with a concept. It needs to have a certain capability. It looks to see if it has that capability within its force. If it doesn't, it says they have a capability gap. And then they look at ways to fill that gap, either by doctrine, by training, or by developing a piece of equipment or combat platform that can take care of that capability. So then you come up with a capability solution. So I'm going to be talking about capability a lot during this presentation. And this is the actual document that comes down from the Joint Staff that tells us how to do that. It's about that thick bunch of rules. It's real boring. But that's really how it comes out to be. Let's take a look at the need. In 1939, the United States Army was really small. It was a small, about 180,000 man army thereabouts. Most of combat capability in the Army was in the National Guard, part-time soldiers and whatnot. And a lot of our modern doctrine had not yet been developed, if even thought of, that we end up fighting with in World War II. A lot of us was just starting to think about it. Well, what happened in 1939? The Germans overrun Poland, and they overrun Poland quickly. And everybody looks at that and they go, wow, the Polish army was pretty good, pretty brave, and pretty large, but the Germans took it in about a month. And the reason why was because the Germans hit them with what was called blitzkrieg tactics, and with a highly armored and mechanized force that could maneuver very quickly. And the United States Army went, uh-oh, we don't have the capability to stop an army built to fight like that. So they had a great capability gap. So in 1940, the U.S. Army was scrambling to get an anti-tank capability. And what happened in 1940? The largest army in the world was defeated in a month, the French Army. And the French Army had an anti-tank capability, and it failed to stop the Germans. So the Army went, wow, we really need to come up with a concept to do that, because if we have to fight the Germans, we're going to have to stop their tanks. So General McNair, who was the commander of Army Ground Forces, said to the U.S. Army, we need to develop a capability to stop the German armored force. The first thing they did was copy the German anti-tank gun, the 37 millimeter. And they put it into production. That gun will quickly become obsolete, but it was all we had. It was actually a pretty good gun for what it did. It could kill all light armored vehicles and light tanks out to about 800 meters. But as you'll see, tanks started developing really quickly. And this is actually a 40 millimeter Bofors, so it's a tiny bit bigger than a 37. This was how big that shell was, thereabouts. Okay? So they went on to develop a 37 millimeter. The French had a very robust anti-tank concept, and the Germans broke right through it, and were off to the races. So, in 1941, the General Marshal, who was head of the entire army, decided that we really need to have some kind of a concept that was highly mobile, that could meet the Germans with their mobility and knock out their tanks or at least stop them. So then there was a big debate. Is that a job for the infantry? Is that a job for the artillery? Is that a job for the cavalry? And by the way, the cavalry in 1941 still had horses. Okay? Or do we come up with something new? And believe it or not, the armor doctrine had not been solidified yet in the U.S. Army at that time. So they really weren't sure what tanks were supposed to do. And they were looking hard at what the Army was doing. And we didn't have a really good tank in 1941 either. So if anybody who was in the Army, everybody knows in the Army fights with itself. And it fights with itself inside the Army over budget. So artillery said, no, we can do it. Infantry said, no, we can do it. The armor guy said, we can do it. And the cavalry guy said, we'll do it if you don't get rid of us, but we're getting rid of them, so that they really didn't count. So there was a bunch of meetings and arguments and debates over who in the United States Army would do this. In 1940, this was the tank threat. We start over here in the upper corner, that's the German Mark IV. And it was an infantry support tank, had a low velocity 75mm gun. None of these on this slide were heavily armored. The 37mm gun at normal engagement range could probably knock it out. In the top middle is the Japanese Hago tank, Type 95. That's actually in 1945. That picture was taken to surrender, and they used that tank through the entire war. It was a light tank. It was a good tank, but it was a light tank. You have the Panzer II on the other side, a very light tank. In the middle, you have the Czech T-38, the 38T, I'm sorry, and it had a 37mm gun, a really good mobile tank, but again, lightly armored. And then you had the Mark III, which was the mainstay, this guy. Most of the tanks in the German Army were this one. Again, with a 37mm anti-tank gun, lightly armored for its time. The reason why all these things didn't have much armor was, well, the gun that was going to hit them was a 37, so they figured at long range they could stop it. And light tanks moved well, so you would have a lot of mobility. So keep in mind, this is what the threat was in 1940. This is the M3 37mm anti-tank gun. My father was a 37mm anti-tank gunner in the 37th Infantry Division. He went to the Pacific, though, and fought those little tiny tanks. This was the tank destroyer in 1940. And I did not make a mistake. Okay? Keep in mind, we did not really have the capability to defeat tanks in 1940. Nor did we have a concept of what we wanted to defeat the tank in 1940. So let's keep that in mind. Now, let's talk a little bit about what the difference is between tank destroyer and anti-tank. When you have a defense, and the defense at the time was usually infantry units in a line, okay? The anti-tank concept was you would reinforce these units with anti-tank guns, and they would set up anti-tank guns within the infantry defense. The problem was you didn't know where the bad guys were going to come, so the infantry spread out, right? Well, the bad guys, the Germans, would pick what they call the Schwerpunkt, the point. They'd find a weakness in the line, they would hit, and they would break through. Now, these tank guns, anti-tank guns, they'd knock out some tanks, but they wouldn't knock them out all. And guess what? The Germans keep going, right? Now what do you do? And that was the problem that we were trying to solve. What do you do? The concept of tank destroyer is behind this line, you will have tank destroyer units set up with their reconnaissance elements out in front. And what the reconnaissance elements do is they find these bad Germans where they're coming, and the tank destroyer units would then move to the point where they can converge and mass their fires of all the tank destroyer units against those breaching tanks and defeat them in mass. And that was the concept. So if they break through here, you hammer them. And then if they break through over here, these guys move into another position and do the same thing again. In order to do that, you have to be highly mobile. So we were debating how are we going to have this mobility with these tank guns. So you see the difference. This is very defensive in nature, and although this is part of the defense, it's a kind of a counteroffensive way of going after the enemy. So it's using your mobility to get them. And that's the difference in Tank Destroyer Doctrine and Tank Doctrine. Tank Destroyer Tactical Doctrine, and this is right out of the field manual from 1944. You can download it online, it's available, and I'll tell you again how to get it if you want to train yourself on how to be a tank destroyer. One of the things that they came up with was, you're going to be in probably a lightly armored vehicle or be manning a gun. You had to be very aggressive to go after tanks. In 1940, there was a thing called tank shock, and the French experienced that. So did the Poles. All of a sudden, you're sitting there with your rifle, that's the rifle and some hand grenades, and 4 of these machines come clanking at high speed and belching a lot of lead at your direction. And some units just kind of froze because the shock of being hit by that was too much. The idea of an aggressive training was to overcome that, so then you can find out, you can maneuver to hit them in the flank. So they built an aggressive spirit into the tactical doctrine. As a matter of fact, they built it in a little too much. They found out in the first manual that was written in 1941 that the aggressive spirit that they trained these guys were causing them to get killed because they were really going after the tanks a little too aggressively. So they kind of pulled back on that a little bit. The second thing was to have mobility, so you can make this maneuver. You had to cooperate with other troops. The one thing these guys can't really do is hold ground against other infantry, because they don't have that small arms firepower. So you had to have cooperation between artillery, infantry, and tank destroyer units, and armor units if they're there. The second thing is the fundamental principles were you had to have reconnaissance, and this is what was called combined arms. It was the first unit in the United States Army that took two different arms and put them together. It took a gun arm, firepower arm, with a mobile cavalry, the reconnaissance guys, and put them together under one commander. That had not been done before in the U.S. Army. So it's the beginning of a combined arms concept. The idea was you had to have dedicated reconnaissance out in front of you, eyes on the enemy, so you can predict their route, find that terrain, because another part of reconnaissance is to find good terrain, from which to emplace your guns to defeat the enemy. You had to be able to move into position, engage by fire, and then move to another position. So mobility is crucial. Tank destroyers, they ambush hostile tanks. They do not charge or chase them, okay? Because guess what? The tank will probably end up turning around and defeating you. When enemy tanks advance, the tank destroyers would hold their ground. And we'll see in one action where that was very successful. When enemy tanks withdraw, they move in forward positions to continue to engage them with long-range fires. The Tank Destroyer Command. The Army debated, do we stand up another branch, like the infantry branch or the artillery branch? And they decided not to. What they established was kind of a quasi-branch, and they called it the Tank Destroyer Command. And the Tank Destroyer Command's mission was to develop the doctrine, develop the training, train the force, and importantly, equip the force. So determine how and what they're going to build to make this thing work. They established a planning branch under Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Bruce, who will later on be a Major General within 2 years. So he did quite well. And they came up with two concepts. They'll have a tank destroyer command and independent tank destroyer units that will work as I just mentioned, and they will develop anti-tank battalions for the infantry division. That was the kind of unit that you were in. The anti-tank companies in the infantry regiments and anti-tank battalions at the division level. So it's kind of a combination. The infantry school would manage the anti-tank guns that were organic to the infantry, and the tank destroyers would be the mobile force behind them. Now, you come up with a concept that before you spend the money on building a base, building training, buying equipment, manning it, which was a lot of money, you got to figure out, does it work? We just don't do it because we think it's going to work. And back then, they couldn't do computer war games. They went out in the field and they did maneuvers. And they had umpires that says, okay, he shot you, you're dead, and those kinds of things. In the very first, these were called the Louisiana maneuvers. They happened in Tennessee, Louisiana, and North and South Carolina, but they've been known as the Louisiana maneuvers. The very first one, they had no anti-tank capability, and that showed them the armor forces defeated the infantry forces and broke through every time. So that confirmed the need for the capability and confirmed the capability gap. Later that same year, in the Louisiana maneuver, they came up with makeshift tank destroyers. They painted trucks and called them tank destroyers, put a wooden gun on them, and they went out there and they practiced the concept, and it stopped the enemy tank advance. So now they're on to something. And then in the last set of maneuvers in North and South Carolina, they actually used real trained tank destroyer units, and they again stopped one of the armored divisions. They also were looking at what was really happening in the desert. And the Germans had a Panzerjäger doctrine, and it's kind of a combination anti-tank and tank destroyer, because they came to the conclusion also that just spreading out your anti-tank guns didn't really work, and they started massing them on what was called the PAC front, the Panzerabwehrkanonen front of units. And the idea was you canalize the enemy tanks into a position where these massed anti-tank guns would fire into them. And we were looking at that. And it was very successful. So we came up with the Tank Destroyer Command. First was established at Fort Meade, Maryland. Now, if you've ever been to Maryland, you don't have a lot of room to maneuver in Maryland. So they started developing the doctrine and everything. They said, we need a lot more land. So they went to a wonderful place called Killeen, Texas. Have you ever been to Killeen, Texas? It's in the middle of nowhere. It's still in the middle of nowhere. And they, by using emergency war powers, they purchased all the land out there. They just displaced families that had the land forever. They paid well, but they didn't have a choice. Here's your money, get off, we're making a base. And they made the largest U.S. Army base, which is still in existence to this day. Camp Hood at the time, now Fort Hood. And they put now Colonel Bruce, he's been promoted with Eagles, and he was in command and established the Tank Destroyer Command and Center and their training school there. And look how fast they've done this. This is from 1940 to early 1942. Now, if you've ever written doctrine in the U.S. Army, and I participated in that when I was a captain a long, long time ago, it's a phenomenal effort, a lot of people, a lot of work, a lot of testing, and you can't just do it overnight. And they pretty much did, which I think is amazing. All right, then there was this argument, and this argument did not get settled until 1945. Do we use guns with a gun on a carriage that's immobile, except when it's towed by a truck or a half-track, or do we make a vehicle that has the gun that is self-propelled so the gun can maneuver around? And this was a huge fight. General McNair wanted guns. Why? He was an artilleryman. He understood guns. And he figured the gun was inexpensive. I could make a $1,000 gun and it could knock out a $30,000 tank. To him, that was economical, and that's what he was thinking. General Bruce, however, he said, I don't want those guns because the problem with it is when I go to move them, I have to hook it, I have to drive up the prime mover, I have to stand up, I have to hook it up, I have to reload my ammunition on the back of the truck, and then I can move. In that time, the enemy's going to go, hey, they're hooking up their guns, they hit you with artillery, and you're doomed. Okay? So he did not want that because it didn't really, to him, meet the mobility requirement. So he wanted to have a self-propelled one. But you remember that picture of the one from 1940? We didn't have it. We had anti-tank guns. So, in the great way of making decisions, we decided to do both. We would have some battalions that were equipped with guns, and some battalions that were equipped with self-propelled vehicles, which we had yet to develop. So, we started trying to figure out what to do. And I'll tell you, I could do a 2-hour-long lecture just on the concepts that we tried. They tried all kinds, and these are some of them. I'm not going to really go into much detail about them, but they were all failures, every one of these, okay? They just didn't quite make it. The most interesting one is up by the word proposals. That was some tractor company in Cleveland, Ohio came up with this idea, and they put a 3-inch gun on this thing, and every time it fired, it would flop over, or catch on fire, do all kinds of stuff. They actually put it into production, and this was one of the first congressional investigations to the misuse of funds, because they built 200 and some of them, and General Bruce goes, "You got to be kidding me, I don't want these." See, in the Army back then, the command said, "I want something," and the ordnance people said, "Okay, thank you, go away, we'll figure it out, we'll get it for you." And they did. And that was what ordnance came back to him, he goes, "I don't want this stupid thing," and he didn't use it. The only one that actually saw some use that was quite effective was this guy right here. That's on a half-track, that's a 57-millimeter gun on a half-track, and the Russians love these. So we built a bunch of them and gave them to the Russians. But we did not use those. We tried putting a 37-millimeter on a Jeep. Well, with just the gun, it was fine, but when you put 4 cases of ammo on it, the thing couldn't get out of its own way. It lost all its mobility. So we tried putting it on a little bigger truck, and it still had the same problem. It just didn't work. So we are back to this. This is what we first started equipping the tank destroyer battalions with, the 37-millimeter gun, and we hooked it up to the Jeep. And that's what you did. You drove it around the Jeep, or you got a bunch of Bubbas, and you moved it like they moved guns in the Civil War, by pulling them. And that's what we first went in with. That was our first towed tank destroyer, back to the anti-tank gun, the 37mm. But then we found out, as the war went on, it wasn't killing anything. So we went to the 3-inch gun. This was a Navy gun. What was interesting, the United States Army was really kind of behind the curve in developing guns, so they just went and looked out the hands. Well, the Navy was really good at guns because they put them on ships and they needed them. So we took the 3-inch gun from the Navy, and unfortunately, though, we didn't develop a good carriage. We just plopped it onto the artillery carriage for it. It was the same use as the 105 gun, which made it very high and very heavy. And very high and heavy meant 2 things. When the Germans spotted you, you got machine gun because you couldn't move the thing. It was too heavy. But it was a very effective gun. 3 inches is 76.2 millimeter. The gun was a really good gun. So now we're kind of figuring out, well, how we got this great gun? What do we do with it? We also considered the 57mm anti-tank gun. The Tank Destroyer Command did not adopt this gun. They decided that we need something that's more powerful than the 57. The Infantry Center did adopt it, and thus you had them in the anti-tank units, in the infantry units. This was an American development of the British 6-pounder. And this is the 6-pounder cartridge, anti-tank cartridge right here. And this is the 57mm anti-tank cartridge. You're going, what's the difference? There isn't one. It was the same thing. Okay. But notice, in order to kill things, what's happening? It's getting bigger. 2 things. It's getting bigger, and you're getting more power to push it faster. Okay? So this is not a tank destroyer. This was an anti-tank gun. So we went back to the idea of let's put guns on back of trucks. So we took the Dodge WC-52, sent it out to South Dakota, Fargo, South Dakota, where a company mounted a 37mm anti-tank gun on it. And this was not intended to go into combat. This was intended to train people on tactics and develop the tactics and doctrine. But like anything, when you have it, you use it, and it ended up going into combat. The picture on this side shows it in North Africa fighting against the Germans. What do you think happened to those guys?
good.
They got hurt because they had absolutely no protection. So we had the half track, and the white half tracks, the M2 and the M3 half tracks were wonderful vehicles. And so the Tank Destroyer Command, knowing that this would be an interim vehicle, this was not intended to be the final vehicle, but a vehicle to get the M3, the M5 gun onto a vehicle, we call it the M3, with the M5 gun on it. And the idea was it would fire at long range, and the light armor of the half track would protect you against machine guns and shrapnel. And actually, at long range, it was very effective because the front view of that is very thin, and if you properly place it, the enemy had a hard time spotting you. But once they spotted you, any return fire would probably kill this vehicle because it was so lightly armored. But we used these in the desert. These were also then, after the Army was done with them, what does the Army do with its equipment it doesn't want anymore? It gives it to the Marines. And the Marines used them in the Pacific right up to the end of the war as a fire support vehicle, and they loved it. So this got the 3-inch gun onto a vehicle. Now this is not a 3-inch gun round, we don't have one. This is a 75. It's 76.2 millimeters, 3 inches, so it's about that size, just to give you an idea of what we're going. Its casing was much bigger though, because it was much more high velocity. Then we took the Sherman chassis, which was a great vehicle. The Sherman was a great vehicle. I will argue all day that it was the best tank in World War II. But it was also mechanically reliable. So we took the Sherman chassis, we put light armor on it, not heavy armor, and we put an open top turret, and we put the 3-inch gun on it, and we came up with a 3-inch Gun Motor Carriage M10. And these were called, the British called them the Wolverine. We never officially named it, but that kind of stuck. Why do you think it was open top? Anybody have an idea?
Cut down on weight.
That's part of it, cut down on weight because you didn't feel you needed the armor on the top because he's going to be back. Observation was the big thing. You had all 4 crewmen up looking with their binos, sir.
Oh no, he got it.
He got it, yep. Observation was the big thing. As a matter of fact, how do you think this thing would be used in cities?
Subject to sniper fire.
Subject to sniper fire, dropping grenades on it. Believe it or not, they were very effective in the city. And when the infantry went into Aachen, they had 2 battalions of these in support, and they employed them properly. What they would do is they would clear into the city, then bring them in behind them. As they went down the street, they would keep the guns 2 blocks behind where it was already cleared, outside of sniper range. They would make sure there was no enemy infantry around it to drop grenades in it, but then they had the guys up observing, and whenever they spotted bad guys, the infantry guy would raise his rifle and point to where the enemy was, and they'd let loose with the 3-inch guns to take care of it. It was a very effective tactic. The crews loved these vehicles. They absolutely loved these vehicles. They were highly reliable. The gun was very effective. And when they were ordered to turn them in for the M18 Hellcat near the end of the war, they didn't want to do it. This was what General Bruce wanted. This was the only tank destroyer designed from the bottom up as a tank destroyer. It was a small vehicle, relatively small vehicle compared to other armored vehicles. It had a very good suspension system. This was one of the first uses of this type of suspension system that's still used today in the U.S. Army. And it had a 76 millimeter gun, not a 3-inch naval gun. I know it's the same size, but it was a completely different gun. It was designed to be an anti-tank gun, long barrel, very high velocity, and it was a very effective vehicle. This was the fastest armored vehicle of World War II. That's what General Bruce wanted, so they could do this maneuver quickly. These things could go up to 40 miles an hour on the highway. And they were built where? Does anybody know? Buick up in Flint. Yep. So you would rather drive a Buick, right?
With the GS model.
And these started fielding in small bits at the end of 43, starting in 44. By the end of 1944 to 1945, we were fielding a lot of them. Absolutely another mechanically sound, highly reliable vehicle. But the crew still like the M10 better because they were used to it.
Was that the Christie suspension?
No, that's not a Christie suspension. This is a torsion bar suspension. Christie suspension is different. And I'm not an engineer, so I can't really explain the difference. But this had alternating torsion bars through the center of the vehicle, and they would go like that. It's a very effective system with return rollers. Christie's don't have return rollers. That's how you can always spot the difference. Then there was this guy. Well, when the Tigers and the King Tigers and the Jagd Tigers and the Hunting Jagd Tiger 2 showed up, we did not have anything that could defeat them frontally. As a matter of fact, we couldn't defeat the Panther frontally outside of 500 meters with any of the previous guns. So we were developing out of the 90 millimeter anti-aircraft gun an anti-tanking capability, just like the Germans did with their 88, but it's heavy. So we needed a vehicle that could do it, and we never could design, we didn't design a vehicle from the ground up. We took surplus M10A1s that were built by Ford, and we built a bigger turret, and we put this on, and it came up with the M36, which was unofficially known as the Slugger, or the Jackson. The British called it the Jackson, we didn't. The Slugger name may have been for World War II or come after, no one really knows. Initially, General Bruce did not want this vehicle because he wanted every of his effort put into developing the M18. But when European command started screaming, we need something to take care of these big cats, they fielded these. When they went into combat and they were killing everything that they came across, they started saying, give us more. So we had to take Sherman chassis, sacrifice the mobility because of the heavy armor on it, and plop a turret on it. Then we took M10s, took the turrets off, and converted them near the end of the war. Integral to this was that reconnaissance. How do you do reconnaissance? Well, you got to develop a light vehicle, and we came up with the M20 and the M8 series, and also the M3 Scout Car, which was used a little bit, but not too long. Based on a 2.5-ton truck was the M8 Greyhound, had a 37 millimeter gun for self-protection, and a 50 caliber machine gun. The M20 was the same vehicle without the turret, just a machine gun on it. These were highly mobile. They could move fast. They had very high power radios so they could get out in front of people. Their idea was not to fight. The idea was to go find. And these were the reconnaissance elements within the tank destroyer units. Very important vehicles, actually. Okay, how did we do this? Well, here's why we start seeing how the tank destroyer concept sort of maybe worked and didn't. We had this concept that we were going to stop the mass German armor attack against us. Well, guess what? When we got into the war, we were on the offensive mode strategically. And only occasionally did the Germans take the operational offensive against it, never a strategic offensive. So we never faced that mass German armor. So the concept, the capability that it was meant for never really came about. So, and then by end of 1944, the Germans were running out of tanks. We really didn't have many tank battles as compared to the Russians. I mean, you read about them. If you compared it to, though, the German armor was destroyed on the East Front. And what was left, we fought. And we'll go through some of the great armor battles and how tank destroyers worked on it. But we never really faced that massive German armor except in North Africa. And maybe, you could argue, maybe in the Battle of Bulge. So, did the Army have an excess capability already in 1944? That's a good question. All right, tank destroyers in action. This is a famous picture of the tank destroyer unit at El Guitar. That's one of the company commanders telling his lieutenants where the in places. And, you know, remember they get the gun on the half track, the M3. Very famous picture of that action. So we're going to take a look at some different situations where the tank destroyers were used. The first was the 601st. That's what the previous picture was, the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion. and the 899th. This was at El Gutar. This is after Kasserine Pass. And we started counterattacking against the Germans, and the Germans had a doctrine to attack whenever they can. So we're counterattacking against the Germans, and they counterattacked us. And we knew they were coming. Because why? We had all the reconnaissance assets out there, and we saw them coming. That gave us enough time, if if you look up here, these are the tank destroyer units. And that's all high ground. So, remember the guy with the M6 with the Dodge truck with the 37 on it? And the M3 half-tracks, those were in the 601st. They went up on the high ground and were firing down into the Germans as the reconnaissance units kind of maneuvered the Germans into this kill zone. The Germans saw what was happening and tried to take that high ground. And that's where the tank destroyer units suffered some losses when the Germans tried to take that high ground. But what then happened is the Germans looked like they were just about to break through. Remember that breakthrough that I was talking about? Just as they were about to break through, the 899th with M10s came down the valley floor with their reconnaissance guys in the lead, found the German tanks, and started picking them off. The German offensive was stopped. Over 30 German tanks destroyed, and apparently a few Tigers were killed by the M10s, which was interesting. But there were heavy losses to the M3 and the M6. The M6 was immediately withdrawn from service. It was found that you're suicide demand those things. And the M3's days were kind of over, and they said, "We hurry up, get us more M10s." So that's what happened on this. But what this proved was, when the Germans did mass their armor, and if we found them maneuvering, the doctrine worked. Exactly like it was planned. You kind of put an anvil, which was the 601st, and the hammer was the M10s of the 899. Okay, Mortain counteroffensive. Anybody ever heard of the Mortain counteroffensive? This was after Normandy, and we made the breakout. Hitler ordered us to cut off the Cotentin Peninsula. And so they counterattacked into 2 U.S. infantry divisions. And it looked for a moment that it might actually work, but it really didn't have the power to do it. This is an example of the towed tank gun in the defense. This was a M5 3-inch gun tank destroyer unit where the lieutenant went forward, he talked to the regimental commander, and the regimental commander made a smart decision. He turned to him and said, "Lieutenant, you're the guy that's trained in this. I'll give you all my anti-tank guns. You figure out how to defend with it." So this was one of the problems. The armor and infantry commanders never really learned what the tank destroyer doctrine was. They learned their doctrine, but they never really knew what the tank destroyer doctrine was. And this is kind of a micro case of how it was supposed to work. The tank destroyer guy shows up, he knows how to do it, the commander goes, "I trust you, go do it." And he did. He set up this, if you look, the arrows have nothing to do with anything. I found this map, it was the only map I could find with it. Those arrows are the pictures that go along with it, or tell me where the pictures are. But if you look real closely, you see these little tiny X's? Those are all the tank destroyers and how they were set up. And notice they are set up almost in a 360-degree perimeter and in depth. And what happened is, in the morning, the Germans thought they could take this town, and it was a crucial town for the Mortain, to continue the Mortain offensive, and they ran into M5s in the mist. It was foggy, and they drove down this road in column. They were in column sitting ducks, all their half tracks, and the M5s let loose and wiped out the Germans. And they fought for 5 days. The tank destroyers held this town against the German assaults. The Germans never took it. They ended up losing 2 platoons out of the battalion, completely wiped out. This is where they really found out that, these guns are great to shoot at the guy, but we just can't get them. We just cannot maneuver them out. And that's when this was kind of the beginning when the Army started going, maybe we don't want these total guns. They just don't do that maneuver part very well. In the Bulge, The Bulge, of course, was the great counteroffensive. We all know the story. We've seen the movies, where the Germans counterattacked in December against us. And there's really three great actions that prove the stopping of the Northern Shoulder, St. Vith, and Bastogne. And we're going to look at how tanks and destroyers were used in those three actions. This is the North Shoulder. The Northern Shoulder was hit at a town called Krinkle and Rokeroff. I've actually been there. I've walked this battlefield. It's quite interesting. It's a typical Belgian town, stone buildings, and if you've ever been to Europe, they just follow the street. So when you come down these streets, you got stone buildings on both sides, your tanks are kind of canalized. Well, if sitting at the other end of the street, the tank destroyer, you're going to be in trouble. You pop the lead tank, and now the Germans can't move. The 644 tank destroyer, which had M10s and a towed gun with M5s, held up the Germans at Krinkle and Rokeroff, and they were cited by the Army German 12th SS Panzer Division commander says it was the tank destroyer's heavy resistance that stopped me from advancing in a timely manner. Now we had to pull out of Krinkle and Rokeroff, but it was the delay that happened here that held out. And at the bottom here you see this happy crew of an M10 tank destroyer. They were an ace. They killed over 5 German tanks in this engagement. Did quite well. And some of them were Panthers, as you see the Bernie Panther up there. So here's a case where the tank, and look at these guys were rolled in quickly. If we don't understand the Bulge, it was like, uh-oh, the Germans might break through, and we just started plugging gaps. We knew we had to hold this shoulder, because if we lost the northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge, they could get to the river quicker and get around us. So by holding the shoulder, we forces them to go south and around and up to get across the river. St. Vith. A couple years ago, Phil Naud came here and gave a great talk in the Battle of St. Vith, looking at the 106th Infantry Division, which was, everybody criticizes for surrendering, but it's 2 regiments that made it off the Schnee Eifel, defended very well at St. Vith. He gives a great talk if you ever get a chance to see it. They'll go into detail about this battle. But a M10 battalion was way behind the lines, converting to M36s. So they had about half M36s, half M10s, and they get the phone call. Go to St. Vith and stop the Germans. Okay. So they moved out, they were in Holland, and moved all the way to St. Vith. Now we see not just tactical mobility of the Tank Destroyer Command, but the operational mobility. The mobility to go from one part of the front to another quickly and have impact on the battle. This was the battle that proved that they need M36s, because they ran into a lot of Tigers and Tigers IIs, and the Panthers, which nothing could defeat to the front. You had to hit it from the side and rears, unless you brought one of these guys with a big 90mm. And that's this. That's this one. It weighs a ton. But this is the 90mm this is just the AP round, not the APCR, but it's the AP round. So if this was full of propellant, it would be twice as heavy. But so now you see how big it is, and of course with all that propellant, it's going to go very fast. So that's what was proven at this engagement. But this one shows the operational mobility of Tank Destroyer, and that concept works. That you can be in one part of the battlefield, and the need is over here, and the units can move quickly because they have the mobility. And one of the things about mobility, probably the most important thing about mobility that nobody considers is maintenance. If you can't fix them, and you can't fix them quickly, you have nothing to be mobile with. And American equipment was the best to maintain. It was the great concept in World War II. German tanks broke down left and right. Their transmissions were crappy. They caught on fire. Their gears flew apart. They had to be replaced constantly. Usually a German tank battalion could not move a long distance. They had to put it on a rail car because they'd wear out their tank. American tanks and American tank destroyers could move over 100 miles without maintenance breakdowns. And that was crucial in these kind of battles. At Bastogne, we all know who won the Battle of Bastogne, right? It was the 101st Airborne. And they don't like to tell you that 2 tank destroyer battalions and a couple tank battalions actually helped them out. Okay? They had 2 tank destroyer battalions, the 609th and the 701st, both M18s, these are with the new Hellcats, maneuvered. One was at the Sour River, and the other was near Aachen. Got the order, move to Bastogne, report to the airborne commander, and he'll tell you what to do. So they did it. And they got there. The 705th was sent out as part of Team Desibris, which was put in front of Bastogne. Team Desibris was pretty much wiped out over a series of days, but what it did was it slowed the Germans down and allowed the 101st to dig in and build its defense around Bastogne. The 705th destroyed 39 German tanks from 19 to 26 December, and they only lost 5 M18s. So they did a great job. The 609th was used mostly in a kind of an anti-tank role around the perimeter, but it was very effective. But again, what was the key was we got there. You know, in the Civil War, they said who gets there the firstest with the mostest wins the battle. And this is an example of that. Other combat roles. Well, as I said, the Germans weren't massing tanks against us except in the offensives that I talked about. Most of the time, their tanks were either spread out or they just weren't there. So you have this asset, especially in Italy. Italy, we didn't face many German tanks after the initial invasions, but we had a lot of tank destroyer battalions. They ended up acting in many cases as artillery, in indirect fire, and it was so well used that they started training the crews on that, and they started issuing as part of their equipment all the stuff they needed for indirect fire. So they became artillery. Also was used as an assault gun. That's when I talked about in Aachen, that's really what their role was. Knock out bunkers, had heavily dug in infantry positions. They were pretty good. And one thing tank destroyer units had was a lot of radios. So you could get all the way down to platoon level with a lot of communications, so you could maneuver these people. It was intended, so you could maneuver a lot. And so they were allowed to move from roles to role. They supported infantry, and as we were about to win the war in Europe, they started looking at, well, how can we use these in the Pacific? Because the Japs didn't mass tanks at all. They did it once in Okinawa, and it didn't work. They got their butt kicked pretty bad. So they didn't really need an anti-tank role, except maybe an invasion of Japan. But what they needed was a lot of assault gun type of work. So they started developing tactics to knock out those very well-hidden Japanese bunker systems that was causing us a lot of casualties in the islands. So they started looking at that. One thing that happened in the Tank Destroyer Command, they had, above the battalion level, they had group and brigade headquarters. And the idea was that would be the guy that controls this maneuvering of the battalions. As I said, the infantry guys and the artillery guys, and those are the guys that became division commanders, they didn't grasp that. And when this colonel shows up with his staff, they go sit in the corner, I don't need you. So the group headquarters were rarely used effectively. That also happened in the independent tank groups too. Their headquarters weren't used that often. Some smart commanders went, oh, you're a headquarters, huh? That means you have radios and a staff and cooks and mechanics, and they used them as a task force headquarters and assigned armor, infantry, and tank destroyers to them and used them effectively. There were a few cases of that. But what the Army ended up saying is we don't need that level anymore. Near the end of the war, they decided to get rid of them. The demise of the tank destroyer. First, after 1944, that whole thought of what to do with these towed guys, the ones that had to be hooked up to a truck or a half-track, they finally said, we're going to get rid of them. Turn in all your towed guns, you're going to get an M10, an M18, or an M36. And so they started retraining those battalions. After the war in Europe, the European Command did an assessment. They brought in commanders of tank destroyer units. They asked division commanders. They spent about half a year analyzing this, and they came up with these conclusions. You need high velocity anti-armor capability. You've got to have it. That's the only thing that's going to kill other tanks. They said that looking at the modern tank that was coming out, the M26 Pershing with a 90mm gun on it in a fully protected tank, that might not be as mobile as a tank destroyer, but mobile enough, they decided that we will now just give this mission to the tanks. So the tanks will have to train on their exploitation, their defensive measures, and maneuver and fire against other armor. And that was probably the smart decision. They originally said that the deep organic anti-tank defense would go to the artillery, but after a while the artillery went, no, we really can't do that. And that capability would not come until the 1990s when I get the Copperhead round. So that ended up being dropped. And they said that tank destroyers as a separate force was unnecessary. And that was probably a good decision. Now that doesn't mean it was a failure. And it doesn't mean, all it really means is that that concept of a separate force was really unnecessary, because what really kind of made it bad for the tank destroyer was when there was no enemy armor, you had this capability that you spent a lot of money, time, and effort on, and it's kind of like sitting there. There were cases where they turned, there was an M10 battalion in Europe that was turned into a military police unit. Okay. Park your tank destroyers and go direct traffic and arrest people. That probably went over well. But, and some of them were turned into supply units. They just, I had to hear your labor go to work. It just, if the capability need was no longer needed, why do I have this force? So the Army went, oh, well, we'll need it sometime, so we'll train tanks. And if tanks go to a theater that have a lot of enemy tanks, they'll emphasize that training. And we train like that to this day. So that kind of stuck. So what did the tank destroyers do for the U.S. Army? Well, we go back to that slide where I showed you the 1940 tank destroyer, which was a blank slide. Along with that one, there was no doctrine, there was no training, there was no equipment, there was no anything. So, in just a matter of less than 2 years, the tank destroyers developed the concept, how to fight tanks, equipped the force, trained it, and got it over to theater where it actually went into combat. That's phenomenal. Really, if you understand what the United States Army was like in 1939 and 1940, and what it was like in 1942 and 43, they're miles apart. And that's not a lot of time. Nowadays, it takes us over 10 years to develop a combat vehicle. Okay? Over 10 years. A lot of it has to do with the technology and all the testing requirements that Congress has put on it. And they're for good reasons. Back then, if it fired and it moved, it went to war, okay? That was kind of it. We also showed the need that you've got to plan for and have the capability of high velocity fire to kill other tanks. When the Sherman went into combat, it had a mid-velocity gun. It wasn't low, but it wasn't high. In 1942, when it showed up on the battlefield, it could defeat any tank except for the Tiger. But that's what was coming. It was heavier and heavier and heavier tanks. After World War II, the tanks got really heavy. We called them medium tanks, but they were much heavier than what a medium tank was in the middle of the wartime. So it showed that we had to have this. It also was, as I said, first time that combined arms was used. And the Army took a look at that and said, you know what, we need to train across our branches. And they started instituting that to the point to this day we have combined arms.
Just curious, is that large item on the back of that with the star on it?
That's a wading kit.
That's a deep
That's the
wading
wading kit,
device?
so it doesn't drown its engine when it goes across water.
Never seen one on one.
It also was the idea of understanding combat depth. In World War I, we had the line. And that was it. Maybe another trench line behind it. But the idea was very linear warfare. World War II was changed the idea of combat, where you would have to layer your defense, use mobility, and fight in depth and not just fight in depth, but maneuver in depth. And maneuver in depth means you might have a unit in Holland that the next day has to be somewhere in Belgium to do the fighting. And that was an eye-opener to a lot of people. It also taught the Army that you really have to train your guys to be aggressive. And aggressive training works, doesn't it? That's why you faced down a tank and knocked it out, because he was aggressively trained, okay? You just don't train him to shoot. You got to train him to have the guts to go do it, really. And it takes a lot of training to do it, because I'll tell you what, when I was in the infantry, they put us in a hole and they drove tanks over us. And it is not fun to have a 70-ton thing come driving right over your head. Okay? It is a little bit scary. And that guy's not even trying to kill you. Think about when they are trying to kill you, okay? So the aggressive spirit was good. It also came up with the concept of support by fire. And support by fire is where you don't charge into the enemy. You find a good position and you hit them from 1,000 yards. You put fire onto them. You use distance as your favor, which then in turn means you have developed the weapons that can do it, because the ones we had couldn't. So you had to do that. You had to think it through. And you have to balance your combat vehicle. It has to be agile, mobile, maintainable. It has to have firepower, and it has to have protection. And I'm telling you, there's a finite amount that can go into a tank. And so sometimes you sacrifice armor to have mobility, sometimes you sacrifice firepower to have armor. Yes, sir?
I just wondered, was there any major changes in armored doctrine after McNair was killed?
Yeah, they got, well, the big thing was they were able to get rid of the gun thing, because that's what he was a big, all the way up to his death, he was in favor of the towed gun. And when after he got blown up, they go, well, we don't have to worry about that argument anymore. But no, there was no real major changes in doctrine until after the war was over, when the Army started looking at the doctrine. You don't have time when you're fighting. I mean, you can make changes and tweaks and whatnot, but the major change in doctrine came after the war. And guess what? They did destroy tanks, and they did a really good job of it. And that's what's interesting. So, I'm sorry, that's not a failure, mind you, okay? Look at this. Out of the 39 tank destroyers that they did an intense study of, each one killed 34 tanks. They, overall, in just the 3rd Army alone, the tank destroyer battalions killed 686 tanks and 236 self-propelled guns. Now, those self-propelled guns are probably including things like the skirmishers, the assault gun, and those things which were actually kind of being used as a de facto tank turret. The 823rd said it was the best with 113 destroyed, and that was disputed by 773rd, and one was from Michigan, one was from Ohio, so they probably are not kidding. But that's a pretty good record. I never found the total amount that all was destroyed. I don't think they really knew. Not all units reported well. I thought I had the losses down here, but I guess I didn't. The losses were, in some cases, some of these units had a 10-to-1 kill ratio, but overall it was about a 3-to-1. Now that's not bad. In the attack, it's usually the other way around. You're losing 3 times as many. So, and remember, we were on the offensive most of the time. So the tank destroyers did pretty well with a 3-to-1 kill ratio overall. So, that's it for tank destroyers. But guess what? There's more. Did the need to destroy tanks go away? What's really interesting, from the 1960s to the 1990s, we actually faced what we feared in 1940, the massive armor onslaught from the Soviet Army. The Russians had a gazillion tanks and armored fighting vehicles to carry their infantry in Europe. They were the first ones to deploy an infantry fighting vehicle with the BMP in 1960. And they had tanks, and they had a lot of them. Now, they weren't the best tanks in the world, but they're, quantity has a quality of its own, as Stalin said. So we really were worried about this massive amount of tanks coming into Central Europe. So some of the aspects of the tank destroyer, the Army wouldn't call tank destroyers. They'll never do it again because they didn't work. Okay? But they actually were still using some of the concepts. One of them was developing a combined arms concept. When I was a company commander of a mechanized infantry company, I always was part of a tank battalion in the field. When I was in garrison, I was in my infantry battalion. When I was in the field, I was always part of a tank battalion. The same one, every time. So I trained with them and I knew what they were going to do and they knew what I was going to do. We also developed what was called the Echo Company. Our M901 anti-tank vehicles, which carried the TOW missile, originally were in the headquarters company, and they would say, okay, send 2 of them to this company, and 2 of them to that line company, and 3 of them over there, and hold 4 of them in reserve. They realized they were splitting, they were watering down their firepower, and what they did was, in the mid-1980s, they came up with the E Company, where they put them all in one company under the command of one commander, and they would mass those missile firepower. So that's going back to that concept of mass firepower and mobility. Congress, in the 1970s, passed a law that said every platform that the U.S. Army fields to Europe must be able to kill tanks. That's why the Bradley got missiles on it. The U.S. Army did not want to have missiles on the Bradley. Congress said, we did the math. You don't have enough tanks and enough M901s to kill all the Russian tanks. The Bradleys are going to help. So now we have all this firepower that we could mass. And that's how when I was going to defend Hunfeld, Germany, to stop the 8th Guards Army, I was the anvil. Remember those guys up on the hill at El Guitar? That was my job. I was going to be the anvil. That made me feel real good. The Russians were coming right at me. But what we were going to have on the flanks was tank companies, M901 companies, and the A-10s and Apaches coming in. We were going to channel the Russians in this big valley and just pick them off. The same concept. It's the same concept. Aviation went through the same struggle from Vietnam on till the 1980s. Do you make it a branch? Do you steal guys from the infantry and make them pilots? That's what they were doing. Half my class at Fort Benning became helicopter pilots. And then they said, you know what, it's too expensive and everything, we just make it its own branch, its own training, and everything. So they kind of inherited the tank destroyer concept because they are the very mobile. They are the guys that can go from here to there fast. You ever seen an Apache fly? It flies really fast. And you can mass 10 Apaches, each with 20 missiles, Hellfire missiles, fire forget missiles. They can wipe out a whole tank regiment. 10 Apaches can. So we were adopting that into the aviation, that concept of tank destroyer, whatever you want to call it. The problem is they're extremely expensive. The helicopters are expensive, the maintenance is expensive, to get them to places is expensive, fuel, so it has its drawback. These are the anti-tank platforms that, through the Cold War up to the modern day. You know what's interesting? We went back to that concept of finding a vehicle and plotting something on it, just like we did at the very beginning. And we kind of didn't learn, you really got to design it from the ground up. But it's money. The M113 over here, which that's the M150 with a tow on it, and then we decided we'll put the tow missiles in a little turret with nobody in it, and you can raise up and protect the vehicle. That's the most produced combat vehicle the U.S. Army's ever made. It comes down to economics. It's expensive to make 200 vehicles. It's not as expensive to make those 200 vehicles out of something you made 10,000. That's why. The Striker is our current one up there in the far right. And it's the same concept of having a turret that comes up. Those are in the Striker battalions. That's their anti-tank capability. Plus we have Humvees that have tows on it. We use those effectively in Iraq. As a matter of fact, that's how they killed Saddam Hussein's son. They didn't shoot him. They fired tow missiles at him. I'm not kidding. And that's how they got him. And then you have the Apache, which is Hellfire missiles. With the longbow Apache, that's what's there with the radar. what it does is it comes up the treetop, it sticks that little radar dish above the trees, does one spin of the radar, finds all the tanks, it raises up, the computer computes, it fires all its missiles, it drops back down. Missiles are still in the air. Amazing. Okay, these were my sources if you want to read more. A really good book is The Tank Killers by Harry Yeedy. That was kind of my main source. It's a couple hundred pages. He goes into details of all the training and all the actions that the tank destroyers use. If you want to continue on and learn more, I recommend that. Nicholas Moran, he does the view from the turret. He's a major in the New Jersey National Guard. He does research. If you play World of Tanks, he does a lot of the research for him. He wrote a book called Can Openers if you want to see how all those vehicles were developed. That's what his book is about. That's a really good book. You can get it for about $60. It's not bad. Gun Motor Carriage, it used to be available here. That was a history of the M10 and the M36. And then if you go to Tank Destroyer Net, this is a fantastic website. And it was done by people whose dads were in tank destroyer units, and they put together this great thing. You can find unit histories, you can get to download their yearbooks. They have battle plans. They talk about all the doctrines. You can download all the manuals, gazillion pictures of all the units. It's a really great site. On the other side there were some articles that I used. One of the official U.S. Army stories was Seek, Strike, and Destroy. It was written at Fort Leavenworth in 1985. And then, of course, the 2 field manuals, which I downloaded from Tank Destroyer Net. And that's all. Do you have any questions? Sir?
In your research, did you find out who our leading tank destroyer ace was in the war?
The only thing I found was that one crew. But I didn't go into all. Let me see. There were 220 battalions. There was 100 battalions fielded. Actually, 70 made it to combat. That was a lot to look at. So,
right.
And like I said, they weren't all well reported.
Yeah.
But a lot of that information is on there. I know that one crew was considered one of the best individual crews for one particular action. Sir.
How did M18s end up in Bosnia?
Oh. We equipped the Yugoslavian army in the late 1940s. We were trying to get Tito. Tito was never really in favor of the Russians. He didn't like them, although he was a communist. So we kind of tried to influence them, and we gave them a lot of surplus World War II equipment. They're still using M18s and M36s over there. They're still there, still in use. That's how good they were. That's how they got there.
They didn't take tank destroyers to Korea during the war, but I see that one document you showed they still were in existence in 1951. That's for Europe.
Pardon me?
The tank destroyers were still in use in 1951 or not?
Not in the U.S. Army. Not U.S. Army. No. Most of the M36s went into foreign military sales. The French and the Vietnamese got a lot of them, and they were always used in assault gun roles. And maybe an anti-tank or whatever they had.
Comment. In my experience, the best anti-tank defense was a battery of 105s with a really good forward observer with radio contact to the battery. If you could cover those tanks, just keep hitting and hitting and frequently our rifle companies that actually call fire right on the whole positions. They were foxholes and tanks were on top.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because what happens when the tanks come under artillery is they button up. They go down inside their hatches, and now you're looking at the world through a big, thick piece of glass.
Somebody could button them up with rifle fire.
And it's not easy. And that comment is why in the study they said that the in-depth anti-tank should go to artillery.
I have is every German tank that was knocked out was claimed by the Air Corps, the artillery, bazookas, and if you counted up all the claims of tanks knocked out, it was probably 10 times what the Germans had.
Yes. And that happened in Desert Storm too.
Yeah.
that if you go read the anti-armor study from Desert Storm, they say most of them, the claims were most of them were by A-10s, but about 90% were by Abrams tanks and anti-tank missiles. It's just, they're fly boys. I was an advisor to a fighter squad, and let me tell you, there's big egos there, okay? Yes, sir.
We happen to know that in Poland, they have a post they're setting up there. People are calling it Fort.
Fort what?
Fort Trump.
Okay.
What are they anticipating in Poland, or what equipment do they have? Do you know anything about that?
Well, yeah, what was funny was in the mid-2000s, we withdrew all our tanks from Europe. And in the last 4 years, we've sent them back. And we have put a forward base with an agreement with the Poles. We have a brigade now that rotates into Poland. It's a deterrence against the Russians. That's what that's for. Yeah. But the Russians aren't massing a big armor force on the Polish border like they did in the German border. This is more the use of the military for political deterrence than right now military deterrence. But you know, never know what's going to happen. So yes, we have a tank. We have I think it rotates between a heavy armor brigade and a heavy mechanized infantry brigade, depending. But it's not a permanent station right now. I bet it will become one. Now, Dave Corey was very nice to bring. His great uncle served in one of the tank destroyer units, and he has some pictures and the map where his uncle would have went across Europe. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, he was a tank destroyer driver. He drove the M36. He was in country. He was in basic in September '44. Got in country on a continent in January of '45. Drove through on the M36, a 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion. Then did occupation duty afterwards. So a lot of the photos and stuff that's post-war when he was he actually got transferred out of the 702nd when they went stateside, and he ran a motor pool in Germany until '46. He got out.
Sir.
In Dalton Cooper's book, Jeff Tracy talks about later in the war that they would combine arms. They put tanks up front and infantry in the middle, and they put M7 crews to the back. And when they ran into barricades, they would have this rolling assault where they were firing over the column, breaking the rope a lot. And really sound really risky but aggressive.
Well, yeah. I was taught lead with tanks. Always lead with tanks. Except in close environment, you lead with infantry. Your most protected asset should always be the one up front. And that's why you lead with armor. You have infantry following to support it, because if you run into the tank killer nowadays, the guy with the RPG-7, one little guy in a hole pops up and shoots you. We found that out in Iraq the hard way. We learned that lesson in Vietnam, and we relearned it again in Iraq. That a single infantryman with an anti-tank weapon, handheld anti-tank, can be very dangerous. So that combined arms methodology all has to work. How you set up to maneuver depends on the situation. The answer in infantry school is, how do you do this? And you always say it depends. It depends on terrain, the enemy. And you got to think through how you're going to do this. So that is a technique. But you got to remember, Bob, though, in late '44, especially in the early 1945, the Germans were pretty much shattered. It was pockets of resistance, like you probably encountered, that once we broke their front, we were going from village to village and taking them. So aggressive maneuver is needed, so you keep them on the run. You have to. And as you remember, Rock's thing, we did the exact same thing when we went into Baghdad in 2006. Same exact thing. He maneuvered in exactly the same way. Tanks, infantry, followed by artillery. Because the priests did have the mission of direct fire support against bunkers, tank traps, and things like that. Because they were starting to replace the M8s with M7s near the end of the war in the gun platoons in the tank battalions. So that's why very important. Because you don't got time to stop, put out your aiming stakes, get out your aiming circle, go, because that's what you have to do back then. It was to do indirect fire is very mathematical. Now they punch it in on there. They have an amp.
Yes.
Believe it or not, an indirect fire amp. Boom! And it goes directly to the guns now. The gunner just stands there, watches the gun go, and then he goes boom, because they still pull a lanyard because it makes them feel good. So you know. Any more questions?
You were saying earlier in the lecture about the 75mm mounted on the half track that the Russians really liked it. Then you said that we didn't use it.
57mm.
No, it's 57. Okay, so we use 75 in Pacific and North Africa.
Yes, we used it. Ours was the 75.
I thought you were referring to the half track itself.
It was the half track,
But we didn't use it.
but we mounted the 57 on it and we sold them to the Russians. The Russians liked the 57mm anti-tank then. They liked it so much they developed one that was a very high velocity one using a tungsten round, and it could kill Panthers. The problem was they didn't have enough tungsten, and so they didn't employ it that much. But they liked the 57. They liked everything we gave them. So once they gave it, they go, oh yeah, we'd like to send us more. Remember, Bruce wanted to standardize the round I don't have, 76mm round, 76.2mm round. He wanted 76mm round. He wanted to standardize across the fours. So the 57 didn't keep that deal. That's why he did not want another ammunition in his supply cycle. That's why.
Now, with the Sherman tank, the Brits put a 17-pounder in it. Is that equivalent to 90 millimeter?
No, 17-pounder is
Well, you remember
almost 77mm, I think. It's a 76 again, but it was chambered. It was chambered for a round that had a case this long, so it was fast. See, velocity can make up for stuff, you know, and it was an extremely fast round, and it was very effective. There was two problems with it. We didn't make it, so we weren't going to use it. Okay, that's problem number one. Problem number two is the Brits couldn't make enough of them just for themselves. They only fielded 1 17-pounder per tank platoon. Okay, they didn't mass those, which was interesting. They put 1 17-pounder and in a 5-tank platoon. It was 4 75mm equipped Shermans and 1 17-pounder. He provided overwatch in that platoon. Then what they did is they go, you know, this is a really good gun. So they modified their M10s, and they called it the Achilles, and they put the 17-pounder in it. But that was Royal Artillery. They kept the anti-tank concept in the artillery. And those are all artillerymen, and they employed them in batteries, but they used it for mass fire. So they were starting to do that, but it was you gotta imagine though, to be able to handle those kinds of pressures, it's got to be a very well-made gun, so it takes longer to make and whatnot. So there were productions with it. The United States ended up with 2 battalions of Fireflies in Italy in late 1940. Why they went to Italy, I do not know, because we weren't facing tanks there. But that's where they ended up, and I don't think they saw combat. We did end up buying them.
Part of the problem with the 17-pounder was the Sherman was in England and it was remanufactured. So they weren't manufactured with the 17-pounder. There was a field conversion, basically.
Yeah.
So it took a lot of work and effort.
Yeah, and what's funny was they were using the old turret, and they had problems for ammunition storage because that was a big round, and they had to put a counterweight on the back of the turret, and it was again more weight on the tank. It had all these issues for not being, again, not developed from the ground up. And you don't have time to develop things from the ground up when you're in combat. So yeah, there was production considerations and issues and what. They would use the T-23 turret, would have been probably a better idea.
Like you said, they had the box in the back, and part of it was so they could handle the round in the turret because it was so small.
Yeah.
Was the 90mm gun rifled or smoothbore?
Rifles.
Rifled?
Okay. We have a great audience. Thank you very much.
Really fast enough?
No.
But yet they wanted that, they got a problem.